with calculators on our computers and in our pockets, I wanted to start the discussion with, do kids really need to learn math?
Well, that is a very interesting question, and we've had a lot of parents and educators bring this up, because it seems like, what we do in school is we answer these questions that we can just do on a calculator. It
Right.
seems kind of useless.
Pointless. Mm-hmm.
In that environment.
Right.
But the way that math is actually used to solve problems in the real world is nothing like in school. Math is a language. And it's used, and a big part of using math in the real world is just figuring out what question to ask. What problem am I even solving with, quote unquote math, which is not just, drilling equations, but actually using it to solve a problem, to understand the world better, and to communicate precisely.
Wow, yeah.
And so it's just kind of like, well, are you actually asking the right questions? Like, is your data valid? All of these things play into math in the real world that isn't in schools and isn't something a calculator can do. It's not like the calculator can't be like, hey, there was a lot of selection bias in the people you interviewed in your survey, so I don't think this data is even valid for you to run statistical analysis on. Like, your calculator isn't going to tell you that.
Right.
But that is something that you do need to learn, and then using
that you use math for.
That you use math to then actually, understand the world better.
Okay, yeah. You just covered a lot of ground there. So let's rewind a bit. So why is math a language?
So that's a great question. Essentially, math is the language of logic. It allows you to communicate precisely without emotions, and it also allows you to really generalize problems, because let's say you're facing a problem in your life where, let's say, you started this new morning routine, and at first it was like super exciting, and you were like, I'm hitting it, I'm going to the gym, and then I'm, brushing my teeth,
I'm reading a book, feeling so cool.
And then as you keep doing it, you're like, I don't really know if I like this anymore. And then you're thinking, oh, maybe it's because this morning routine isn't good for me, and I need to do something different. But how can you really know that if you don't have tools to generalize the problems? And let's say you're using the mental model, diminishing marginal utility, which is also a concept in economics, which involves a math. You're basically mapping a curve where initially morning routine was super exciting. You were getting a bunch of utility from it because it was new.
It was, yeah.
And then you kept doing it, and because of that, your happiness level kind of plateaued out. And that's something that can be mapped and generalized, and you can notice, like, hey, when I'm eating pizza, the first bite is amazing. And then, my 15th slice, I want to puke and die. It's like,
I want to fling the pizza at the wall.
Yeah, it's not enjoyable anymore. And that's something that can be mapped in a distribution mathematically. And that's something that is also a way to generalize the problem, so you can know, is this actually something which I need to have this knee-jerk reaction? Because you might have an emotional reaction of like, morning routines aren't for me.
Right,
I don't need a routine. Like, that's something.
But you need to learn the way of thinking,
Exactly.
the logical way of thinking, where you take the data, you take the objective things that you know, and you put it together to make a logical conclusion.
Exactly.
And it's like a lot of people, well, we've met quite a few different kinds of people doing all sorts of different things, especially in education. And some people that we've met have, varied views on math, and some of them will be like, okay, take this really specific thing of like learning how to calculate this super specific complicated fraction or something like that. I have never used that in my life. And it's like, well, yes, but it's a way of thinking. It's the logical way of thinking where
These are tools that you can use to better understand the world. And a lot of the reason why people may not understand that is because they've never done it, because it isn't taught in schools. You're learning the tools but you're not applying it. And because of that, the tools seem useless.
Uh-huh.
But the thing is that when you're learning math, you're not just learning math. You're also learning how to do hard things and knowing that you can understand complicated concepts. And just, sometimes when I was teaching myself Algebra 1, I would be learning concept and it made no sense to me. I'm like, how does this even work? And I would just bang my head up against the wall for 2-3 hours and I would finally get it. And when you have that moment, you realize, okay, this was so complicated. I thought I would never understand. It took me a really long time to understand, but then I understood it. And that's something that if kids never have that experience, if they just give up, then they're going to avoid hard topics and they're not going to think that they're able to do it. And that, I think, is something that can be really damaging if you then say, okay, well, you're having trouble with this, let's do something else. And then you just kind of have that negative feeling associated with that thing, and you're like, then you're trying to avoid it instead of being really curious and saying, hey, that's hard, but that doesn't mean I can't do it anymore. And so I think that is also a really important part of this, is that you're learning all these skills that come with just that process of just, going through it and understanding these concepts. You're learning problem solving. It's also something where you can really discipline your thinking, because unlike with some other subjects, you know the right answer, right?
Yeah.
It's objectively
It's
true.
objective.
And in a lot of cases, there isn't a right answer.
But in a few things, including math, it's objective.
That can help you to be more disciplined in your thinking when it comes to these other subjects, because you can know that some things are going to be more true than others, even if you can't know if they're true.
Yeah.
And having that process of seeking it out can help you in all these other areas, even when you won't necessarily know if you have the right answer.
So with math, I really liked what you said about it being a language, and it's like all of these different components. It kind of adds up to a really logical and generalized way of thinking, and an objective way of thinking that you need. But how are we supposed to teach that? How are we supposed to teach that in a way of, when a lot of kids, when they hear the word math, they picture, the cartoony signs of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division.
Right.
And then they think of hours of just doing problems, right? But that's not, how are we supposed to use this in the real world? And how do we learn it in a way where it's a way of thinking and that we can come back to it and we know when to apply it?
Yeah, well, I think part of this is that, with language, there are some components that you need to kind of just drill and understand and just, check those boxes of like learning the alphabet, learning grammar structure. Like you're supposed to capitalize the T at the beginning of a sentence, and you need to add a punctuation at the end. And it's just learning some of these rules and fundamental, foundational concepts that allow you to then use and apply language. You're not really communicating when you're singing the ABCs, but it's something you have to do in order to then use it as a language. And it's the same for these foundational concepts in math. And I do think that reaches way beyond just, the foundational addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. And because as you get into higher levels of math, you can then, generalize and communicate more complex, information and concepts through math, as we're talking about math as a language. But then you need to start to move into actually applying it. And that's a big part of what we do is having examples and thinking through ways that kids can actually apply these through creating projects. So there's a ton of examples of how we do this. So one example is I wrote a project on utility functions, essentially using math to express a philosophical concept of how do humans gain happiness. And you would think, like, how are we using math for that? But essentially, it's an optimization function where you're trying to maximize utility, also meaning happiness.
Yeah.
And there's several variables. One is there's a little g, which is essentially how much of a good thing you get. For example, you might really like cookies, and so g would represent how many cookies. And when with the little g, it's essentially representing good things. And so you could get happiness from kind of negative, more like vice of like, maybe I'm eating 2 buckets of ice cream while like binge watching TV, and that's something that gives you happiness, but is it really good for you? Probably not. So when it comes to, so there's 2 sets of variables. So there's the small g of like how let's say you really like hanging out with friends, and that's something that's healthy, right? And it's good for you, and it's like how many hours are you spending with friends. But then that's multiplied with a big G of how much happiness are you actually gaining from it, because in some cases maybe you're like kind of distracted and you're not really in the moment with your friends, so then you're getting less utility per hour spending with your friends,
right?
And so then there's another set of little b, which is, how much of a bad thing, how many cookies am I eating or something. And then there's how much utility you're actually gaining from that. And then it's plus the variable, I forget the variable letter, but let's say it's C, and that is your baseline level of happiness. And so then, given this equation, this is obviously a very simplified version of, what is actually going on in our brains when we're generating happiness.
Is something that is really hard to super accurately map objectively, but you can use that way of thinking to make it more clear and use it as a tool.
Yeah. So essentially, in this project, I defined 3 strategies for gaining happiness. One is just trying to get more stuff.
Right.
So it's like, okay,
get more cookies,
I'm going to get more
cream.
cookies. I'm going to hang out with my friends as much as possible. I'm just trying to increase little g and little b. And then there's another strategy of increasing your appreciation of these things. Of, I have 1 cookie, but I'm going to savor this cookie. I'm going to really appreciate it and try to improve the amount of utility I'm actually getting.
I love the way you're explaining all this.
Yeah. And then there's, I'm hanging out with my friends. I only have an hour, but I want to be as present as possible, really be there in the moment and appreciate that time. And that's a completely different strategy for trying to optimize happiness. And then the last one is improving your baseline level of happiness, which can come from meditation. It can come from, having a good sleep schedule.
Your baseline of happiness.
Eating healthy, just having all of these things that can come into, what's your resting level of happiness. And
the one you always come back to.
And that's something that can be influenced through a multitude of ways. And that's a completely different strategy for optimizing utility or happiness. So that is something that I communicated through a mathematical function that couldn't be as precisely communicated without it. I could say like, hey, you should appreciate your cookies or something, but that doesn't really communicate as precisely the concepts that I was trying to communicate in that project. And so we have a ton of examples of this, and you can see this especially prevalent in mental models, like I mentioned, diminishing marginal utility. Then there's also things like positive versus negative skew distributions when it comes to decision making and thinking, is this something that is actually that is likely to work out for me or likely to go south? And all of these are just ways of understanding the world, your decisions, and also how to communicate that in a precise way. So I think that the drilling the foundations and then applying it in these ways go hand in hand, and actually not only teaching math but also helping students develop an appreciation for math and an understanding of how it's actually important in their lives.
And what does that label actually mean?
Exactly. And so that's something that we do with our math demo day, where students will create a project about it and then present it to other people. And that's something that process can really help to also strengthen the foundation when you're teaching, because you kind of have to understand it from a very base level and work your way up, because you're teaching it to somebody who may not know these concepts.
Yeah, but you're also, not only in the math demo day, but with so many other projects, they're using math all the time because they have that way of thinking, and we're working on growing that.
Yeah.
And when you have that way of thinking, then it's really it really helps to improve the way that you think about different things, and then you're also applying that in so many different things.
Yeah.
Because it's so relevant if you know it. And if you understand it, it's so relevant to so many different topics. And so you're going to be adding that to all the things that you're learning.
Exactly.
It's just so much easier to communicate because it's a completely different realm of knowledge.
Yeah, well, it is something that it really allows you to generalize your way of thinking instead of just reasoning from anecdotes, which is what humans are naturally inclined to do. Like, we have our experience, and it's so easy to just draw from our experience to make decisions, to think like, oh, I understand this because I did that once, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that is very natural. And this kind of mathematical thinking isn't very natural.
Right.
But it is something that I think is
Extremely
increasingly
useful.
important. Yeah, because part of it is that we just have so much more data now. Because of technology, we're like, the amount of data every year is just growing exponentially, and because of that we have so many new ways in which we can actually apply math. Like, if you were living in a society where all the data was recorded on stone tablets, like, it's very limited the ways that you could actually use math in that scenario. But now it's just so relevant in pretty much every field, and being able to understand, think statistically and probabilistically about your decisions, about your life, is just a way that you can make better decisions in general and also communicate more precisely. So I think that all of these different concepts and understandings can be really helpful, and really trying to apply that in education and helping kids to love math, because it isn't supposed to be this boring just drudgery. These are tools to help you improve your life, and we just need to help kids to see that.